I am thrilled beyond words to be up on the stage, or whatever to call this, with these three artists, all of whom I admire enormously, including for these intrepid journeys that every one of them has made. Between the three of them, they have covered virtually every inch of the planet, I think, and done amazing work in every quarter of it. We are going to start with just 5 or 10 minutes from each of them to sort of give you an introduction to their work, and they all have film or video to go with that. I'll tell you just one thing about each of them and why I asked them to go in the order that they're going in. So we're starting with Sebastian Copeland, who's one of the great polar explorers alive today, maybe the most intrepid explorer we have, going to both the Arctic and Antarctica and Greenland and doing things that to me are utterly unfathomable, and bringing back unbelievable records of what's happening in those high latitudes. And so Sebastian is going to start because Sebastian is sort of looking at what's happening to our planet over a 100,000 million billion year time span. We'll then go to Rachel Sussman, who has done this incredible journey across 7 continents to find the oldest living things on Earth, these trees and other bizarre organisms. And so Rachel, she has sort of used the year 0 to orient it to human time, which she'll tell you about more. But so Rachel is working in the time span of life on Earth, going back 80 to several 100,000 years. And then we'll end with Chris, who is really working on the world we live in now, does a diversity of work. Some of his work is large format photos that really deal with the cost of this consumptive life that we lead, and the other are these photos that, I guess we won't see them, these photos that mean a very great deal to everyone I work with, of albatrosses on Midway Island and what the detritus from what the waste from our life is doing to them. So we will, every one of these artists engages time as one of their subjects, so that seemed a good way to get us started, is to kind of take you from the deep past to the present, and then we'll have time. I have a few questions for them, and then we'll save time for you guys to ask some questions. So let me start with Sebastian.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Well, thank you very much for coming on this Earth Day, and I have, in fact, yes, I've traveled quite a bit across the polar regions, and made it a personal mission to explore the ice realm of the planet. I'm going to sort of free-form it because I brought some images to illustrate a little bit of the talk, but not in any specific order. But my interest spans primarily from the relationship of the ice to the planet, and mostly its systemic transformation as we live in this age of anthropocentric attitudes, and its impact on the environment, and how this relates to our existence in the low latitudes, and its geopolitical consequences. So my work is essentially both as an immersive experience of just capturing these otherworldly environments, and you know, what I like to say about the polar regions, and what's very convenient about them, is it's essentially like going on another planet without having to leave this one. So it's cheaper and you get there quicker, but by the same time, it is generally speaking quite barren of life, and if you get a little claustrophobic in urban environments, as I do, it's a great place to go. But the ice has been with us for a very long time, coming and going over the course of the last 4.5 billion years of this planet. It was 650 million years ago that the planet was entirely covered in ice. In fact, we call it the snowball Earth. and it was the emission of CO2 from volcanoes that generated effectively the first global warming system that melted all of that ice, and it did in about 1,000 years. What is unique over the course of, since 650 million years ago, there's been a variety of different phases of glaciations and melting, but primarily life has formed on this planet from about 580 million years ago, where the combination of water vapors, argon, nitrogen, oxygen, and CO2 created a thin layer of atmosphere, which constitutes an environment that was, that generated life on this planet. And that time between 540 million years ago and 65 million years ago generated the most transformative climatic, geological, and evolutionary changes on the planet, but essentially leading to amphibians and fish and reptiles, etc., and all the way to mammals later on. No time has been more transformed in such a short period of time as the last 150 years, in such a condensed manner. And we are presently experiencing what scientists call the sixth mass extinction event. And that is a time period where we're losing about 150 to 200 species per day. And scientists estimate that by the end of the century, we could lose, and we will most likely lose, up to 70 or maybe 75% of all living creatures. So mass extinction events generally take about 10 million years to stabilize themselves, and we've only been, as anatomically modern humans, been on this planet only for 175,000 years. So 10 million years is a big span of time for our short existence on this planet. So my work is really primarily to try and raise our sensibilities towards these environments, which are quite, otherworldly, but in fact very much terrestrial, and they are very much in our garden. And the thing about modern times is how fast the world is shrinking in relative terms. We're traveling much greater distances. We're traveling faster. We're even now starting to travel in outer space. We're leaving trash absolutely everywhere, including in outer space. And we have grown without much design and without much understanding of the imprint that we leave behind. So it's not so much that we should be to blame, because in reality we've only gotten to one phase of our spiritual development, and we are just about to enter the next phase of our spiritual development. The sooner the better, of course, but in some respect we're still very much adolescents. I mean, considering the world is 4.5 billion years old and we're only 175,000 years. If you look at it on a paleontological time, we've really barely existed. It's just nothing but a blimp. In fact, the analogy that's associated with that is if you looked at the birth of this planet in sort of gaseous and matter form 4.5 billion years ago to today, and if you think about it as one sort of calendar year or geological clock that would start 4.5 billion years ago as January 1st, humans have not, while we've only been here for such a short amount of time, the last 150 years especially, has seen this boom in development, like a kid developing new skills or discovering new toys, which in this case was the carbon energy, and which has improved our quality of life. And to some extent it has been a good thing, and to many other extents it has been a bad thing, both for the planet and in the long run for us. To put in perspective, our lifespan has doubled since the turn of the last century. Our numbers have multiplied by 6, and just in terms of I'm 52 years old. When I was born, the planet was half the population that it is today. So we're seeing this exponentially fast-growing demographic, and with it comes the modern convenience that has been brought to us by technology. and especially by carbon energy. So I'm sort of sharing all of this to place in perspective the work that I do. My work is really designed specifically to invite people into their world. These are landscapes that most people are not likely to visit. I immerse myself in these environments for up to 4 months at a time. I often travel alone. I travel sometimes with a partner, but over great distances. I did more than 4,000 kilometers across Antarctica over the course of 82 days. I crossed Greenland from south to north, 2,300 kilometers of that. I've reached both the South Pole and the North Pole on foot. And these are very, very exacting, very demanding trips. The great thing that they afford me is access. And I always say that photography above and beyond anything else, when you deal with landscape, that is, of course, although I suppose you could say with celebrities as well, but it has to do with access, being able to find yourself in front of the subject, as opposed to some other artist. In fact, these two here who create their subject. But in my case, I'm purely an opportunist. I'm just looking like a predator for my subject in order to capture these images. The upside is I get to share them with people, and it's not completely altruistic because it is a way for me to revisit those quite challenging and often demanding trips. But I at least come back with the loot, and the loot for me is to sit in front of my computer these days as opposed to dark rooms in the old days, and get to relive my missions, and then have the great luck to be able to disperse that into the ether and share it with other people. But the sort of subservient purpose of it all is to actually be able to share it with people and invite them into a shrinking planet, not just because of jet travel, as I mentioned it earlier, but of course because of the reach that we have. Our footprint is getting greater and greater and extending beyond the areas that we live in. The CO2 gets dispersed into the atmosphere, the trash goes into the rivers, persistent organic pollutants or POPs make their ways into the waterways that get absorbed into fish, and then soluble carcinogen, they get taken out to sea and eaten by bigger fish, and then taken up the jet stream, the Gulf Stream that is, and eaten by seals, and then Inuit in the north get to poison their babies with their blood cord or their nursing milk, and these would be industrial runoffs or agricultural runoffs that happen in the lower latitudes. So our footprint expands much further than just our geographical locations, and by virtue of that, the world, which is this limited biosphere, is shrinking. So to finish, because I think I might have extended my 10 minutes. Yes, okay. It's a habit. But the nature of these images is really specifically to say that this is your garden. This is literally belongs to you, and it is a place to cherish and to behold. It is the link that connects us all together. Every single species on this planet breathes the same air that we breathe. They eat the same food in some function or another that we do. They're sustained by the same earth and by the same hydrological cycles. And if we destroy it, ultimately, there is only one thing that it means, and it means that we're actually destroying ourselves. So to learn to love this planet is a way for us to learn ourselves, and that's what these photos are all about. So thank you for your time.
All right, I also run the risk of talking for hours, but I'm going to try to keep it for 10 minutes. So back in 2004, I took a trip to Japan. I got invited by some friends. I almost maybe never turned down an invitation to travel somewhere. I don't have time to tell you the long version of the story, but after having a little bit of uncomfortable time in Japan, in Kyoto, sort of not knowing what I was doing there, I had a new camera. I was making landscape images about the relationship between humanity and nature, and I was feeling uncomfortable, and I thought, I'm just going to go home. And instead, I took somebody's advice who said, if you're interested in nature, you have to go visit the 7,000-year-old tree. So this intrigued me. This tree lives on a remote island. You have to go to the southern point of Kyushu. You get on a ferry. It's a couple-hour ferry ride. Then it's a 2-day hike to visit the tree. So, I was all in. Obviously, I made it there. I didn't get the idea for the oldest living thing standing in front of that tree. We'd like to think with creativity, you have this, lightning bolt moment. But it took a while to process. And it wasn't until about a year later that the idea crystallized in my head, that I was going to work with scientists to find things that have been alive for 2,000 years and longer. So it was important to me that the science was based on factual evidence, that it had this dynamic, creative, travel, personal element to it, and that it also would be a way to connect with a different time scale. So this idea of year zero was something that came to me. So why is it 2016 right now? Isn't it 4,500,000,000 2016? And we can get into that. But at any rate, what ensued was a decade-long project that took me to every continent. I had a lot of adventures. This is me gearing up in the Niels Bohr Institute to image the oldest known living thing in the world, some Siberian actinobacteria living in the permafrost that's between 400,000 and 600,000 years old. I learned to scuba dive. I had to overcome my fear of deep water. This is a 100,000-year-old seagrass meadow in the Balearic Islands in Spain. But this is more what my first dive looked like. So, you don't start out as a pro. But I was there in Tobago photographing a 2,000-year-old brain coral. This is about 60 feet deep, 18 feet across. It was a little terrifying. I don't recommend learning underwater photography while you're getting your open water scuba certification. Just pro tip. I got to spend some amazing time in Greenland. This is gearing up in the Arctic safety suits. I was there to photograph some lichens, so very unassuming, but these lichens ended up being one of my favorite and most pivotal kind of subjects in the project. They certainly have my favorite numerical connection to human life, and that is they grow 1 centimeter every 100 years. And to me, I just get a chill. I mean, it just makes this human connection to something that's so unassuming. You would have no idea that is something that's special in any way, and yet it lives in this landscape. So some of these landscapes really do transport you back in time, like Sebastian was saying. There's some moments where I felt it was really important to include images like this that really transport you along with the images of the organisms themselves. That's another story. So I really won't have enough time. Well, so I was I was camping with some Danish archaeologists who were studying these Norse campsites settlement sites in Greenland. They were using lichenography to cross-check the date of the things that they were studying with lichen growth. This is a church that they dug up. That when I was there with them for about a week, the following week there was a whole row of skeletons that they'd unearthed. This is the other side of the world. This is Namibia, where it's hard to believe anything is growing at all, and yet there's this amazing plant called the welwitschia. A lot of these organisms are uniquely adapted to these incredibly extreme environments. So they tend, one of the things they have in common is they tend to live in extreme environments, so places that have low moisture, low nutrient availability, high temperatures, so other factors that would stress other living things out. These organisms have found their niche and stuck with it. We have the Ureta plant. These live in the Atacama Desert. This is in Chile. Sort of the poster children of the project. They're not moss over rocks. They're shrubs. They're made up of thousands of branches that are densely packed together, and they have a little cluster of leaves at the end of them. That's a Ureta field, or a uretal. I will say a little bit more about this image. This spruce tree, the spruce Grand Picea, this is actually on the cover of my book, and it is essentially a portrait of climate change. And the reason I say this, if you could see that sort of scrubby mass of branches that's down by the ground line, for the first 9,000 years of its life, that's all it was. It never got taller than that. That was just about the snow line. This is on top of a mountaintop plateau in Sweden, in a park, very remote. In the past, it was the first 9,500 years of its life. In the past 50 or so, that spindly trunk started to grow in the center. And that is because the climate zone is actually changing, getting warmer on the top of this remote plateau. So whenever we think that we need to have protection for these organisms, it's absolutely true, but we're so interconnected. We have to remember that there's no part of the earth that's not part of the earth. We are truly dependent on one another. We have the bristlecone pines. Some of you might be familiar with those. They're the oldest unitary organisms on the planet. Likewise, I could go into a number of stresses that they're facing right now. And this is a particularly sad and poignant story. The senator tree, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, was burnt down by some kids who snuck into the park at night. This was living in Orlando. Snuck into the park at night to do meth inside the tree, and then they set it on fire from the inside out, and then posted about it on Facebook and got caught. Obviously, we want to prevent that. There was some small silver lining to the story, and that is because this tree was so special, they had done some research and saved some clippings. So these were about 15 years old, and then they transplanted one back to the site of this tree, and the community decided to name it the Phoenix. So there is hope. How much time do I have?
No, I've done it.
Oh, that's okay. This is another one that we've lost. This is the underground forest in Pretoria, South Africa. This was bulldozed over to make a new traffic pattern. So some of these things are just so outrageous. There are... Okay, I've got... Okay. Well, since I only have 2 more minutes, I have to go to Antarctica too. So, again, this point of there being no place in the planet that is free from human influence. This is South Georgia Island. If any of you are familiar with the Shackleton story, a few people, I could talk to you for an hour about that too, but I won't. This is right around the corner from a whaling station, which was the whaling station where Shackleton actually had come to his own rescue. I was there looking for ancient moss banks. This was my backup moss. So this is a 2,200-year-old moss that I was going to go to if I couldn't make it to the one on the down. It's a little hard to see here, but on the downward slope here is a 5,500-year-old moss bank. This is Elephant Island, which was where Shackleton was marooned for most of I think a better part of a year. And I know it's a little funny, but this is also Shackleton's grave, who, by the way, had successfully, after being marooned in Antarctica for 2 entire years, not a single one of his crew ended up dying. They all made it back safely. He then returned to South Georgia safely and then died of a heart attack the next day. So so I was going to talk a little bit about the connection between, I just wanted to share some installation shots. So this was an exhibition that I had at Pioneer Works, and it's been traveling around. I just wanted to share that, we have all of these incredible stories, and there's all this amazing stuff. We could pull all of these different things apart and just talk about the science, just talk about the climate impact, just talk about deep time and long-term thinking, and all of these things are amazing. But as an artist, one of the things that I'm really trying to do is to weave them all together. So it's very different in book format than it is from an exhibition. In a book, you get to write a whole essay or tell a whole story. This isn't the same setup in a gallery. Here I've included the taxonomy of all of the organisms that are part of the project on the wall. And then click. And then on the wall next to it, I just hand painted the kingdoms that are represented in the project. So I'm trying to start to create some connection between the art and science. Also on my prints, and you saw they're pretty large, on the prints I handwrite the titles on each of them, and that's a nod to scientific field notes. And they all contain the name and the age and the location of the organisms. And I also started to create a research studio installation. So you can imagine, after doing all this research and all this travel, you collect all of these things. And I realized that a lot of this tells a really interesting story that allows a way into the work, because I don't want you to just see a polished, final, pretty photograph. I want you to see how messy and interesting and I want you to feel some of the things that I went through as a way, hopefully, to allow you to enter into the work as well. So I think I'll actually end on this slide. I have several. I was going to show you some images from space and some, but we'll save that for next time. But what I wanted to end on was this idea of temporal layering. So this is me making a photograph of a 12,000-year-old shrub, and it struck me that there's something really amazing that happens with photography and looking at these deep timescales, and that is multiple timescales can exist in the same plane in the same moment. So you have the click of the shutter, so say a 60th of a second. Then next you have me taking the photograph, you observing it, and then the organism that required 12,000 years until it was able to be here and meet us in that moment. So, thank you.
Hello. First of all, just a very quick note of appreciation to Strand Books. This is really cool. I'm super stoked to have the privilege of being with these two inspiring artists who I'm a huge fan of and have been for a long time, and just to share this moment with you guys. I make photographs of giant piles of the things we waste. And I'm only going to show one piece this evening, but maybe you've seen some of my photographs of huge masses of cell phones and plastic bottles, and most recently the work that I've done on a remote island in the Pacific called Midway, that are images of dead baby albatrosses whose bodies are filled with plastic. And the intention behind all of my work is I believe that all of the biggest problems in our world, whether it's environmental degradation or social things like war and violence, they can all be traced. I think all of those things that we look out and we think of those as being the problems, I think those are all symptoms of a problem that lives in the dimension of our consciousness. And so I echo what Sebastian was saying about our spiritual development as a species or as a people. I think we've got technologically much too far ahead of our spiritual development. And so that's the shift I'm interested in, is my work is aimed at shifting consciousness, because I believe if you can shift consciousness, if we could heal this sickness, then everything would change. And what I mean by the sickness, I think, in my own view, it's simply a disconnect, and especially in what we call the first world, a disconnect from sacred, loving relationship with life. With the miracle of our world, and with the incomprehensibly amazing gift of life that each one of us has been gifted. And if we collectively could return to that state of loving relationship with our mother, then we don't even know what would be on the other side of that doorway. And to me, the challenge is to feel it, because we can talk about love. We can talk about, like, it's this word that is everywhere. And the challenge is to really feel it in a way that is deep enough to inspire us to the scale of change that we know needs to happen. So how do we really feel our earthly love? How do we reawaken Venus, reanimate Venus within all of us? And I believe in that way in the transformational power of grief. So that's really what all of my work is aimed at. Because grief, as a culture, we are grief averse. We are afraid of grief. We think grief is a bad feeling. And we think that grief is the same as despair. And we want to get over it. If we feel it, we want to get over it as fast as we can. And if we don't, if we see the possibility of grief, we want to push it away and stay happy, be happy all the time. And in my work on Midway Island, I'd done a lot of grieving for something that I didn't even know I cared about. And in that process, I've discovered something for me about the nature of grief that is totally counterintuitive to me. And it is that grief is not the same as despair. Grief is the same as love. Grief is a felt experience of love for something that we're connected to that we're losing. And maybe only when we lose that thing, whatever it is, if it's a person that we love, or it's a species that's going extinct, or if it's a forest that we didn't even know we cared about, in the process of grieving it, we discover the depth of our own love for whatever that thing is. And so, to me, my belief is that grief is a doorway, that if we collectively could step through that doorway, it wouldn't be into a place of despair and sadness and hopelessness and all the things we fear if we grieve. It would be back to our fundamental state of being, which is to be connected with our love, with the deepest part of ourself where our wisdom lies. And if we collectively could achieve that, then truly things would change incredibly fast. I think it would be the beginning of the biggest party in history. And so I want to share with you just one piece that I recently did that is intended to be a grief ritual. It's short, it's a 4-minute video, and what it is it's the stomach contents of a camel that came from the desert near Dubai, almost halfway around the world from Midway Island. And I have a friend who's one of the world's leading scientists on plastic pollution in our environment. His name is Marcus Ericsson, and he runs the 5 Gyres. He's one of the founders of the 5 Gyres Institute. And he was in Dubai at the laboratory of this very courageous veterinarian who goes into the desert near Dubai and does necropsies of camels. He opens up their stomachs because the desert near Dubai is just as polluted as our beaches and everywhere else in the world, and the camels don't know not to eat plastic. So lots of camels are dying there. And he was in this veterinarian's laboratory, and he saw this giant, horrible pile of about 500 plastic bags that came from inside the stomach of a dead camel. And he said the first thing he thought of was me. and he called me up and he said, "Hey, Chris, would you like me to mail you this thing?" And I'm like, "Geez, yeah, send it over." And it arrived, and it's this huge thing, and it took me almost a year to have the courage to just take it out of the box. It was just the most horrible thing, so I made a turntable and I photographed it frame by frame and made a video, and it moves very, very slowly. So it's a kind of 4-minute meditation. And I intend it symbolically the same way that I do with my Midway work. It's a symbol, it's a mirror for our culture, and I also intend it as a remembrance for this one camel who gave its life to contain this horrible piece of our inadvertent waste. So I call this piece Camel Gastrolith.
So thank you all. That was really wonderful. Chris sort of anticipated. I'm just going to sort of put one question out there for all 3 of you to respond to. Chris has sort of already responded to it, and then I do want to leave time for more questions from you. So I got this rare pleasure of having an excuse to spend many hours with all 3 of their work in this serendipitous juxtaposition. And the thing that I was struck by in all of them was this discussion of love, that a central purpose of their work was to help us love the rest of life on Earth and remember that connection and that responsibility. But I was struck by how differently they each arrived at that, and how differently they each addressed this question of beauty, which is one of these central questions in art. And so I will just throw out my little summary, my hypothesis about each of your strategies, and then invite you to respond to that. So to me, Sebastian, your work seems in the tradition of the sort of capital R romantics, this encounter with the wild, with danger, with the sublime, that inspires a kind of overwhelmedness, a kind of awe on our part. Rachel, your work to me seems almost novelistic in that there is a kind of intimate relationship that you invite us into with these characters, with personalities, and that our love for them, that there's a kind of, Snow and Ice are famous for being perfect, right? They're always recreating themselves into this absolute perfection. Your organisms aren't perfect at all. They're completely bashed up by life, and the way that the people that we love are bashed up by life. And then, Chris, you already sort of got to what I see in your work, which is this desire to wound. And I mean, I invite any of you to look at Chris's pictures of those baby albatrosses and to understand that the reason their stomachs are filled with plastic is because their unwitting parents fed it to them. and not be devastated for many days and never get those images out of your mind. And so that's almost a Greek thing, right? That like the veins being, I mean, it's Oedipus. It's the people sort of having to confront this really dark truth about their relationship to their community and their world. So I will just invite any of you to chime in on that, and then I'll turn it over to the audience.
Welcome. Yeah, I think that was, sorry. I love your interpretation of that. And one thing I'd meant to mention while I was speaking is that I tried to approach my subjects as if I was making portraits of them. So I do have a landscape practice as well, but I felt like that wasn't really what I was trying to do with this work, that if you could think of these organisms more like you would a person, that I was intentionally trying to anthropomorphize them so we can connect all of those things. So we can say, wow, this story of survival is so incredible. I relate to that. And then in turn, I want to do something to help protect it.
Yes, I also liked your interpretation, Miriam. I also find that what you said earlier was very relevant to all of three of those works, and that is this temporal relationship. We're very attached to life as humans because we have this ability to project in time, which separates us pretty much from the animal kingdom, and just about as far as we understand cognitive relationships with the rest of species, we seem to be the only one to understand the nature of past and future and present, of course. And when it comes to my work, I'm very much immersed in the sublime and very much in touch with the fleeting nature of my life and of humanity in general. And with that, I tend to think that I actually take portrait of dying things. And because I'm a human, I have an attachment to dying things, because that's what we do. We're attached to things and we don't want them to go away. So it's a complex relationship between bringing forth this notion of beauty and wanting it to be everlasting, between inviting people to fall in love with their world in order to preserve it, but also recognizing that this world, the more I got to know it, is looking more and more like us, and that is, defiant and fleeting.
I love your characterization as well, and I was noticing. I mean, to me, one of the great mysteries of the medium of photography is that it conveys relationship. When the photographer allows himself to feel something for their subject, to be connected to their subject, then you can feel it in the photograph. And both of your guys' work is it conveys sacred relationship. It's just so obvious that you both hold your subjects in sacred relationship. It's so powerful. The only reframe that I would suggest is that my work is not intended to wound. I believe that we wound ourselves by turning away from our pain for the world. And we all feel sadness and anger and rage and anxiety and fear about what's happening to our world and what's happening to each other, the wars and violence, etc. And my teacher, Joanna Macy, she calls it our pain for the world, and and I've come to believe in my own work and with working with her, we have to feel that pain. And when we push that pain away, we're doing a spiritual harm to ourselves, because in that pain is our life force. That's our soul. It's because our pain is inextricably woven in with our love. Those things can't be separated. The only reason we feel angry when we see injustice is because we love that thing. And the only reason we feel sad when a species is going extinct is because we love those tigers and those elephants and those mountain gorillas. And so when we push away our pain and our sadness for those things, then we're pushing away our love. We're disconnecting from our own self. And so my work is not intended as a kind of exercise in punishment or wounding or pain. It's intended as a reconnecting with the deeper feeling that lies underneath all of those things, which is our love for the world and for life.
I just want to add something to that. Of those last couple of images, I loved what you said and absolutely relate to it so much that it relates to the last couple of images that you skipped through for me, of gold in the sidewalk. I don't know if you guys saw them. It's a project that I'm doing right now called Sidewalk Kintsukuroi. So kintsukuroi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The idea is something is made more beautiful for having been broken. And so I'm taking that idea and repairing cracks in the sidewalk. So it is absolutely about this idea of healing and not trying to say, this is something that didn't happen, and in fact it's the opposite. It's saying embrace it and celebrate it, because that is part of what makes us beautiful and that part of the healing. So while it's not an environmental project per se, it is something deeply related to certainly my feelings and connected to any number of interpretations. But yeah.
I think I will solicit your help after the session on how to not let that grief slide into despair, because it is extremely hard when you look every single day at the rate of extinction, at the rate of ice loss, at the rate of change on this planet, and think about, I have a 17-year-old daughter, and think about the upheaval, and you have small children, that, the world our children will live in. My daughter now says to me, Mom, you can tell me you're sad, you can't tell me the world is sad, and I have to pull back from that, because to me it's it's hard not to slide down that ravine.
I think there's also an interesting dimension to all of this. We live in a time that, in many ways, is spiritually bankrupt, and I mean this. There is of course, still a dogmatic approach to spirituality, but more and more, I think there is a need to reconnect to the spirituality of nature. And if there's one thing that I'm hearing here, is that we're driven, the three of us, but of course with many other conceptual or environmental artists, we're driven by a spiritual connection with the world that we inhabit, and I think profoundly that is the dawn of our new enlightenment, if you will, given that, as I mentioned earlier, we've sort of evolved with that design, not for any fault of ours, but just because somehow we discovered one magic wand, and it enabled us to multiply exponentially, and without a great sense of accountability. And now we're at the sort of this dawn of a new understanding of that responsibility. And if you look at the development, the technological development into new forms of energy production, I think that is a testament to taking a sense of responsibility towards our footprint and our impact on the planet. But there is always still a very, very powerful exercise, which is simply to get out there. I always say that my job is to help people fall in love with their world in order to preserve it. But the reality is there's no easier way to fall in love with your world but to just get out there. And you can get... it's suppressing to be in this very powerful urban city of New York, which I love. I came here first and lived in New York for 4 years when I moved to America, and then I left and went to the West Coast. I know, but the reality is that this is a wonderful, dynamic, and kinetic environment, but it's also very important not just to go to Central Park, but to venture out into this mother, this family of ours, which is outside of this nonsense, which is this kind of kinetic hell that we've created for ourselves, and that this urban life.
So I do want to give people out there a chance to ask questions. Jordan. That was an easy question. Is there a harder one out there?
It's a really easy one. What was the red animal? Was that a dog? That ginger-colored animal that was in one of your images?
Was it one of mine?
Was it, yeah.
A ginger color? Oh, no, I think it was a bear. Yes, it was a polar bear. Yes, it was a...
Looks like that.
The stuffed animal on the ice, you mean? It was actually a dog that I took with me on this particular trip, and on occasion, rarely though, but on occasion.
It was not an easy question after all.
With a dog for bear protection as an early warning. Yeah.
I had sort of just a nerdy question. I wanted to know the dimensions of the real life dimensions of what was found in the camel. Because it was hard to tell from the image.
Yeah. She asked what were the dimensions of the camel gastrolith.
Yeah.
It was. Hold that for a second. It was. It's about that size.
Oh.
Much bigger than a camel's stomach. The camel's stomach, they eat things and then they digest them, and the stomach never has to stretch out. And it's exactly the same thing that happens to the albatrosses on Midway. They eat things that they can't digest, or they're fed things they can't digest, and so their stomach has to expand like a balloon, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until nothing else can go down their digestive system, and they starve to death.
Now I want to say the metaphysical question.
Okay.
I mean, that to me seems like such an incredibly appropriate visual analogy to what you're talking about when you talk about love and grief. Because it seems to me that our evolved conception of love is about consumption and about possessing and holding it in. It's not at all about letting things go free and be whatever they are. It's the capitalist thing. You want to own something you love, and that's what happens. You consume it, and it kills you, and it kills the loved of you as well.
Yeah, interesting. The love of material things, I think that's actually not love. Okay. It's fear.
Yes.
The desire to have things is fear of what will happen if we don't have them.
Yeah.
Fear of scarcity. Yeah. It's really interesting when we have unconscious fears like that, fears that live below the level of conscious awareness. They propagate from the amygdala, and if we can be aware, then we feel it as fear. But if we're not aware, then it goes into the limbic part of our mind, which doesn't feel fear, but it feels other things like anger. So fear can manifest as anger, and it feels very, very convincing that it's anger, but it's actually fear that passed unaware. And if it makes it past the limbic system before we notice it, it makes it into the neocortex and arrives as a thought. Mm-hmm. And so we have thoughts like, oh man, I think we should get a new car. And honey, we need to look at our insurance policies. And I think I'm going to go to law school as my career. And I did that. And only after many years of therapy did I realize that thought that I had that was very convincing, it convinced me for a decade, was actually my fear of doing what I love, my fear of failing as an artist and being humiliated. And when we become aware of our unconscious fears like that, and like all of a sudden it's like, wow, okay, now I have a new choice that I didn't even realize I had all that time.
I mean, but Rachel's work also really feeds, especially this stuff you're doing now with the mending.
Yeah.
I mean, it really feeds into that because the beauty of the object still exists.
Right. Yes, they're certainly not mutually exclusive. Yeah,
We need a new sidewalk.
right. Well, one of the things that, as you posited this point, and Chris, your response, one of the things that I keep coming back to, and that connects all of our work, is time. And so, one of the things that I realized through the course of making The Oldest Living Things is that long-term thinking is one of the most critical things we can do. And also, Miriam, your point about getting fatigued and overwhelmed, I mean, I certainly experienced that as well. But one little thing that we can all do is take a moment. It's both healthy in a psychological sense as well. Like, what is that thing that tells me to buy a new thing or whatever it is? And just take a moment and consider the long-term implications of whatever the decision is, whether it's, you know, deciding to get a plastic bottle of soda or some larger impact thing like, you know, flying somewhere and whatever. There's some very easy way to then continue to connect, and it's almost a moral question at this point. You know, what's going to happen even a generation from now? That depends on what we do today and tomorrow and next week.
I have a question. As artists and designers who are touching on such important subjects of, you know, that go across time and trying to keep us alive as an interconnected system, the work that you all do is really great and impactful, but how does your work, or anyone who's trying to get the message across, go from message to feeling to action at a collective level? Because I think all of you all spoke about how we need to collectively change, and how do we get from these beautiful objects to the actual change that we want to see? That's my question.
Okay, I'll start and I'll let you guys finish. I think it is part of the intangible. It's all that the work is a trigger. Exactly what the charge is something that lives in each individual. The good thing is that we're all interconnected with a genetic makeup that reminds us somehow in our DNA that we are part of this one structure, this natural structure. And there is a lot of noise and a lot of distractions, and you know, consumerism has made sure that we were, you know, fully distracted, and that distraction connects directly to our credit cards and our wallets, so that we get taken into this other stream of consciousness, which is, you know, as Chris was saying a minute ago, driven by fear. But there is in all of us a spiritual dimension, however close to the surface it is. That we all have that. It's our conscience and our ability to emote, and our ability to understand joy and pain and beauty and all those different things. And so the art is one vehicle in many, you know, sensorial perceptions in general are those triggers, whether they're auditive or you know, or touch or vision or etc. They're all trigger for the intangible connection with that spiritual connection. And so art, luckily, is a universal language that somehow gets us quicker from the heart to the mind. But it's not the only tool. It's only one in a multitude of tools. In conservation or in environmental considerations, you need science, you need you know, you need art, I believe, as a means of translating some of these things. And then, of course, you need stakeholders and politicians, and you know, and a whole array of different tools. And art is just one tool in a complex web of you know, reconditioning the way that we look at our mode of development and how we can actually cohabit in a finite biosphere.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I've had a similar question. I mean, on one hand, I felt like I couldn't not do this work. I had to do it. It felt like an important way to try to connect, but also that it didn't quite feel like enough, and what can we do? So one of the things that I did was I became part of Al Gore's Climate Reality Leadership Corps. I recommend you all check it out. There's all sorts of amazing initiatives there. It's completely scientifically backed. There's so much new, up-to-date information that is available there. But it's also about connecting to the way that we live. So one of the campaigns that they did was called Things I Love. And it asked people to, say things, I love red wine, I love chocolate. Okay, well, those things are part of the environment. And so to create a connection point to these things and then provide ways, either on a governmental level to sign petitions, that sort of thing, but also to engage with the community that cares about the same things that you do, and to keep moving towards a critical mass, and we're starting to get there. And I would recommend Al Gore's latest TED Talk that went up in February, I believe. It's pretty compelling. There's the first 10 minutes are about how things are still rough, but the rest of it is about the good news. So I think we need to keep a balance between those things. Otherwise, we're likely to throw in the towel.
I spent quite a few years early in my career as an artist answering the question when somebody asked, what should I do? And I had a list of things. Don't drink water out of plastic bottles. Pump up your car tires to their full pressure when you go on road trips.
Take cold showers.
Take cold showers. Don't ask for a straw when you go to a bar and drink a martini. And
that's not cool.
There's
anyway.
Something that's always and there's something about those little gestures that is, I think, a testament to disempowerment. Because we all know that if everybody on Earth did all those things, it would make that much difference. That the solutions need to be at the scale of the problems. Amen. And as an activist, I'm interested, so how do we get to solutions that are at the scale of the problems? And this, to me, is the distinction between what I think of as mainstream activism and art. And it's why I believe that art has such a transformational power for our culture right now, is that art doesn't tell people how to behave. I'm not here to tell anybody how to behave. And when I think back to how did I make the major decisions in my life, none of them were because somebody gave me a list of things and went like that. It's because I was inspired by somebody, by their dedication to something. So I think it's much more powerful rather than saying you should all care about this thing, is to do exactly what the three of us are doing, is saying, here's how much I care about this thing. And if I can care about it so deeply that I devote so much time and so much energy to it without any judgment about how you should be with it or how you should respond or what you should do, maybe you might feel the same caring that I feel as an artist. And I think that's the most powerful thing that artists can do, is help us tap into what we all feel, like a deeper universal experience of caring for things we didn't even know we cared about. And when we reach that place, you don't have to tell anybody how to behave. They'll go kick butt.
Yeah, I'll just add in that respect that it's true that as an activist, and particularly in the early stages of that, you're always confronted with an easy solution, and with that comes a list of of actions that lack in sort of convincing power, and environmental activism can sometimes come across a little bit like the angry nanny, telling you that you can't do this or you can't do this and that. And the reality is that changes is complex, and while it lives with us individually, it really lives with us collectively much more so. And by that I mean that taking individual action or being enlightened or spiritually aware from an environmental perspective may only have a very small impact, as Chris was just saying, that there is a systemic issue that requires a collective action, and that collective action cannot happen outside of government action. You know, in America and in the West generally speaking, but especially in America, we've inherited 30 plus years of deregulation since essentially the Reagan era, and you know, deregulation is the enemy of the environment, and we have to collectively understand that left to our own demises, just like the bully in the schoolyard, or just like the kid in the toy shop, or the cookie jar, or whatever the analogy, we will go for the cookie. We will go for the toy if we can have it. Nobody's going to watch us take it. That is human nature. Our intellect and our conscience enables us to think beyond the cookie and beyond the toy, and that is political action, and recognizing that we need to be regulated may seem like a difficult place to go to, but ultimately, in the way that we have developed, it is the inescapable path towards a long and lasting change. Without government stepping into it and without our implicit support, we will not change. And you know, if you're here, you're most likely a Democrat. I hate to put it so simplistically, but it's true. And the reality is, we all know what I'm saying right now. The difficult part is to go to people who tell you that, you know, we need less taxes. The reality is we cannot operate with less taxes because there are too many big problems, and those problems are growing, and they will not grow with less taxes. They will grow with more taxes, and we will do just fine with more taxes and with a little bit of less, as long as that money is applied towards making lasting change.
So I have to chime in, since I do work for an environmental organization. I totally sanction Sebastian's view that politics that you have to make systemic change, you have to make collective change. The personal behavior things are, I have a colleague who wrote a book called Will the Planet Notice? And the answer was basically no, it doesn't. The planet, you're recycling, all those small bore actions are not going to be what really makes the difference. What makes the difference are things like the accord that got signed at the UN today, the Paris Agreement, the biggest international agreement ever signed. I will diverge from Sebastian in that I don't think the only thing politics can do is shackle people. I think that, and one thing Rachel and I talked about earlier today was, you know, one thing that jumped out, another thing that jumped out at me about all of their work is that people aren't in it, that people are in it only as the offstage bad guy for the most part. I think a few people, but you know, we are, and I think that is a disconnecting thing if it's us against nature, and that part of what politics can do is actually find ways for people to do the productive human work that people need to do to feed their families and support their communities, but change that work in such a way that it actually benefits rather than destroys the environment. And that's what systems like the Paris Accord, that has market mechanisms so that you actually can be rewarded for doing the right thing. I mean, there's a number of ways that people approach that. But I think understanding that people are a species in these ecologies that have to thrive, and that you have to figure out how to make that happen too. It's the only way you really get anywhere.
Before we go on, I have one more perspective on your question of the what to do, what should I do thing, because I bet it happens for all of us when we speak. Somebody, like, it's the most common question, what should I do? And one thing I've observed, I think, is when someone raises their hand and says, what should I do? They're feeling something. And it might be inspiration, or it might be anxiety, fear. Like when you learn about all kinds of horrible news, you're like, you feel like, what can I do? And so they're feeling something, but they don't know that. Maybe not aware on a fully conscious level what they're feeling. And they want relief from that feeling because they don't want to be feeling that anymore. And so if I say to that person, recycle all your plastic bags from now on, it makes that feeling like go away. And then they don't have that feeling anymore, and then tomorrow they won't go do whatever that even that little tiny thing was. And so I'm interested in what's actually going on in that moment. I want people to feel. I want people to feel their anxiety. We can contain our anxiety. We should be feeling anxiety. As my friend Paul Hawkins says, if you're not feeling terrified, furious, filled with rage, and unbelievably sad about what's happening to our world, you aren't paying attention. So the challenge is not to make those feelings go away, it's to feel them and contain them. And when we can contain them and feel them, that's what turns into rocket fuel to devote our lives to be an artist, or walk to the North Pole, or become an amazing lawyer and get new legislation passed, or whatever is the thing. Like those feelings, that's what drives us. So my answer to the question of what should I do is be with what we feel. The uncomfortableness of what we feel when we look out at what's happening to our world, and cultivate a capacity to hold it.
I think we're supposed to end at 8:30, right? Okay, so we have time for one more question. Is there one more question?
I just want to follow up on the urban hell idea. I would acknowledge that we experience that to a certain extent. However, it seems sort of like a catch-22. As the population expands, the best way we can take care of the environment in general is to get everybody into these urban hells, and where it's more energy efficient, and mass transit and all that kind of stuff. How do we sort of keep from losing even more of our appreciation for the environment as we try to protect it?
Really good question.
Well, certainly urban planning has a lot to do with that. Technology also has a lot to do with that. Biomimicry, application of new architectural designs that incorporates, green and whatnot. But what I was referring to is more of a commitment to go immerse yourself outside of, you're right about there's an inescapable reality about productivity at a certain scale or level. And it's clear because there will be 6.5 billion of us living in urban environments by mid-century. There's 7.2 billion of us today, and there's only 4.1 billion of us living in cities right now. So there will be more than almost 2 billion more people living in environments by mid-century. That is a certain type of reality that cannot be a prison. We have to deshackle ourselves from that reality, if you will, and make a deliberate commitment, whether that is with pressure on local elected office, but also personal motivation to get out, because it's out there. Many solutions to that angst that we live can be solved by a stroll in nature. And by the way, I'm not the first to say it. Hawthorne said it, and Thoreau said it, and every number of different, great environmental writers through the centuries have talked about it, and it certainly is more true today than it ever was. So in that respect, every one of us have jobs, and you have jobs that force you to be close to urban centers, and there's no fault to be had there. But what's important is not to lose track of connecting with that other entity, which is this world that will be there long after we're gone and has been there long before we came.
I do think it's a great question, raising a teenager and the struggle to get, and we spend half of our year in Colorado, so she gets a lot of it, and still the vortex, the suck-in vortex of social media and, all the screens and everything. It's a to me, it's a really, really important question, how we don't lose that connection entirely. But thank goodness we have these three to help reconnect us every now and then.